The county civic center sat on a 2-lane road outside Steubenville, Ohio, and it had been closed since early 2022. The demolition contract had already been awarded. All the county needed was the Phase 2 environmental assessment. The material sampling, the air quality baseline, the asbestos and lead paint survey, and the building could come down. My firm, Haldane Environmental out of Wheeling, had been subcontracted to do the field work. I was the one they sent. My name is Renee. I was 31. I'd been with Haldane for 14 months, long enough to have done maybe 24 of these surveys on my own, short enough that I still got the jobs nobody else wanted. Overnight sampling in a building that had been sealed for 4 years, 60 miles from the office, alone. That was a nobody else wanted job. I'll write the full script now. I got there at 6 in the evening on a Thursday in November. The building sat about a quarter-mile back from Route 22 on its own access road, behind a gravel parking lot that had gone to weeds along the edges. It was a single-story structure, mostly except for a raised gymnasium section in the middle that added maybe 15 feet of height. Tan brick, flat roof, the kind of civic architecture that looks exhausted even when it's new. The county maintenance guy who met me was named Phil. He was maybe 60, short, wearing a canvas jacket with the county seal on the breast pocket. He had the keys and a photocopied site map and not a lot of interest in being there. "Power's on in the main corridor and the front offices," he said. "They kept it live for the alarm system, but it hasn't been monitored in about a year. The HVAC is off, water's off. You got your own water?" I told him I did. I had a cooler in my truck, along with the sampling equipment, the SKC pumps, the cassettes, the particulate monitors, the thermal hygrometer, the digital camera, and the binder with the survey forms and the building blueprints that the county had provided to Haldane 2 weeks earlier. Phil walked me through the front entrance. Glass double doors, one of them cracked, the lock sticky, and into the main corridor. The fluorescents came on in banks, each one flickering for a second before stabilizing into that flat, institutional light that makes everything look like it's already a photograph. The corridor ran straight for maybe 150 feet, with doors on both sides. Administrative offices on the left. Restrooms. A break room with a vending machine that was still plugged in but dark inside its glass. On the right, a set of double doors opened into the gymnasium, and past that, the corridor branched. One branch went left toward what the blueprints labeled as the community meeting rooms and the senior services wing. The other branch went right toward the pool area and the maintenance section. "That's pretty much it," Phil said. "The meeting rooms are unlocked. Pool area's been drained since they closed it. The maintenance shop in the back, I'm not sure about the key, but it might be on here." He handed me a ring with 11 keys on it, none of them labeled. "If you need anything, the number's on the sheet I gave you. But I won't be awake past 10, honestly." He left. I heard his truck start outside, and then the gravel, and then nothing. I should mention what the job actually involved. The county wanted air samples from 6 designated locations inside the building: particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, and fiber counts that would tell us whether disturbing the building materials during demolition would require specialized abatement. I needed to set up 6 sampling stations, calibrate the pumps, run them for a minimum of 4 hours at a calibrated flow rate, and then collect the cassettes for the lab. While the pumps ran, I'd walk the building with the survey forms, photographing and documenting the condition of every suspect material. Pipe insulation, floor tiles, ceiling tiles, window caulking, joint compound, anything that looked like it might predate 1980. I'd take bulk samples where the protocol required it. The whole process was supposed to take 8 to 10 hours. I'd be done by 4 in the morning if everything went smoothly. I set up the first 3 sampling stations in the main corridor, the gymnasium, and the largest meeting room. Each one was a tripod with a pump clipped to it, a calibrated cassette at breathing height, and an index card zip-tied to the tripod leg with the station number and the start time. I used a Gillian Gillair Plus for 4 of the stations and 2 older SKC air check units for the other 2. The Gillair units were reliable. The SKCs had a tendency to lose calibration if the battery dipped below 40%, so I'd charge them overnight and check them twice in the truck. By 7:15, I had all 6 stations running. The gymnasium was the largest space, old hardwood floor buckling near the south wall, fold-out bleachers retracted on one side, basketball hoops still up. The floor was coated in a fine layer of dust that my boots disturbed into slow-moving clouds. I photographed the ceiling, which was acoustic tile suspended from a steel grid, and noted the water staining in the northeast corner. The air in there was cold and stale, and tasted faintly of mildew. I started my walkthrough in the administrative offices. This was the straightforward part. Each office was small, a desk, sometimes a filing cabinet, sometimes a chair. The county had removed most of the furniture but left the built-in shelving. I documented the 9x9 floor tiles, which were almost certainly vinyl asbestos based on the vintage and the adhesive color. I photographed the pipe insulation in the crawl space above the drop ceiling in the first office, which was the white chalky type that you learn to recognize after a few jobs. I bagged a bulk sample, labeled it, logged the location on my form. Routine. The break room still had a calendar on the wall from March 2022. Someone had written, Linda's birthday, cake in fridge, on the 16th. The fridge was still there, unplugged, door propped open with a folded piece of cardboard. I didn't look inside. I'd learned that lesson on a previous job. The vending machine against the far wall was a Crane National model, the kind with the coil dispensers, and even though it was dark, when I walked past it, I heard a faint electrical hum, as though something inside was still drawing power from somewhere. I checked the plug. It was firmly in the wall outlet. I pulled it. The hum stopped. I don't know why that bothered me more than it should have. By 8:30, I had finished the west side of the building, the offices, the break room, the restrooms, the small storage closet near the entrance. I moved into the gymnasium and spent about 40 minutes there, documenting the floor, the ceiling, the mechanical closet behind the bleachers that housed the old HVAC air handler. The air handler was a massive train unit from 1976, and the duct insulation on the supply plenum was exactly the kind of thing we were looking for. I took 3 bulk samples and a dozen photographs. The flash from my camera was the only sharp light in the room. The fluorescents in the gymnasium didn't work. The ballasts were dead. So I was using my headlamp and a clip-on work light I'd clamped to the bleacher rail. Every time the flash went off, the gymnasium briefly became a flat, frozen image of itself. And the after image lingered in my vision for longer than it should have. The dust in the air caught the light like something suspended in liquid. I moved into the east branch of the corridor at about 9:15. This is where the discrepancy started. The blueprints the county had provided showed the building as essentially a T-shape. The main corridor was the vertical stroke. The gymnasium sat at the junction. The meeting rooms and senior wing extended to the left. The pool area and maintenance section extended to the right. According to the blueprints, The right branch terminated at the pool facility, a lap pool, a changing room, a mechanical room for the pool systems, and a small office. Past the pool, the building ended. The corridor did lead to the pool. The double doors were unlocked, and the pool room was exactly what you'd expect. A 25-meter lap pool, empty, the concrete basin dry except for a brownish residue along the deep-end slope. The changing rooms flanked the pool on both sides. The mechanical room was behind a metal door at the far end, and I could see the sand filter tanks and the old chlorination system through a wired glass window. The ceiling was high here, corrugated metal, and the acoustics were strange. My footsteps echoed in a way that made it sound like there was a second set following a half beat behind. I documented the pool area. The ceiling insulation was fiberglass, not asbestos. The floor tiles in the changing rooms were ceramic, not vinyl. The pipe insulation on the hot water lines was foam rubber. Post-1985, I was running out of suspect materials, which meant the building was going to be a relatively clean demolition. Good news for the county. I took my photographs, logged my notes, and started back toward the corridor. That's when I noticed the door. It was in the corridor, about 15 feet before the pool entrance on the left side. A steel fire door, painted the same tan as the walls, with a small wire glass window at head height. I'd walked past it on the way in and assumed it was a janitor's closet or an electrical room. But now walking back, I stopped and looked through the window. There was a corridor on the other side, not a closet, not a mechanical room. A full corridor, stretching back at least 50 or 60 feet, with doors on both sides, and at the far end, what appeared to be another set of double doors. The corridor was dark, but the ambient light from the wire glass window showed enough for me to make out the outlines. Drop ceiling, floor tiles, the same institutional construction as the rest of the building. I looked at my blueprints. There was nothing there. According to the site plan, the left wall of that corridor section was the exterior wall of the building. There should have been nothing beyond it except the parking lot and then the hillside. I tried the door. It was locked. None of the 11 keys on Phil's ring fit it. I stood there for maybe a minute, looking through the little window. The corridor on the other side was real. I could see the texture of the ceiling tiles, the seam lines in the floor. There was a bulletin board on the right wall about 20 feet in, with papers still pinned to it. The papers were too far away to read. I told myself it was a blueprint error. County buildings get renovated, wings get added. Paperwork doesn't always keep up. The blueprints I'd been given were dated 1974, and the building had clearly been modified since then. Someone had added a wing at some point and the plans hadn't been updated. It happened all the time. But the thing that nagged at me, the thing I kept coming back to as I finished my walkthrough of the pool area and headed back toward the main corridor, was that from the outside, when I'd arrived, the building hadn't looked like it extended in that direction. The parking lot ran along the left side of the building, and I'd parked there. The building's east wall had been right there. I'd walked along it from my truck to the front entrance. There had been nothing beyond it. I went outside. It was fully dark now, probably 9:45. The parking lot lights were off. They'd been disconnected along with the exterior circuits. So I used my headlamp. I walked along the east side of the building, counting my steps, trying to match what I'd seen inside with what I could see from out here. The building ended where it was supposed to end. The east wall was a flat expanse of tan brick, interrupted by a few utility penetrations, and a capped exhaust vent, and then it terminated at a clean corner. Beyond that corner was scrubby grass, a drainage ditch, and the hillside. There was no additional wing. There was no extension. The building was exactly the shape the blueprint said it was. I stood outside for a long time. The air was cold and tasted like rain that hadn't arrived yet. Route 22 was audible in the distance, the intermittent drone of trucks heading toward Weirton. I could hear the building's electrical panel humming from somewhere behind the brick. A dog barked far away, twice, and stopped. I went back inside. I walked back to the door in the east corridor. I pressed my face against the wire glass window and looked through. The corridor was still there. I could see it clearly now because there was a light on in it. A single fluorescent tube, halfway down, the kind that takes 30 seconds to warm up to full brightness. It had not been on before. The light was enough to illuminate the bulletin board I'd seen earlier, and I could now read the top sheet pinned to it. It was a printed schedule, the kind generated from a spreadsheet. I couldn't make out the text, but I could see the grid lines and the rows. The fluorescent tube buzzed. I could hear it through the door, faintly, like a sound carried through water. I tried the door handle again. Still locked. I pressed against it with my shoulder. Not hard, just to test the give. The frame didn't move. The lock was a standard mortise type, and the strike plate was solid. I could have forced it with the right tools, a pry bar, which I had in the truck, but I didn't. Here's what I did instead. I called Phil. It was 10:12. He answered on the fifth ring, groggy. Yeah. Phil, this is Renee, the environmental tech at the Civic Center. Yeah, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. I just have a question about the building layout. There's a door in the east corridor, the one leading to the pool, on the left side. It opens into what looks like another hallway, another wing, but it's not on my blueprints. Do you know what's back there? There was a pause. Not a long one. Maybe 3 seconds. But it was a specific kind of pause, not the pause of someone trying to remember, but the pause of someone deciding what to say. That's the old annex, he said. It was part of the original building. It hasn't been used in a long time. How long? I don't know. Long time before I started. It's not part of your survey. Well, it should be. If it's part of the building and the building's being demolished, I need to assess it. I'd have to check with the county on that. It wasn't in the scope they gave us. Okay, but I'm looking at it right now, and there's a light on in there. A fluorescent. If the power's on in that section, someone should know about it. Another pause. This one was longer. The power shouldn't be on in there. Well, it is. Don't worry about it. Just do the areas they told you to do. I'll mention the annex to Jim on Monday. Phil, I can't get through the door anyway. None of the keys fit, but I need to note it in my report. Can you at least tell me what was in there? Offices, meeting rooms? I really don't know. I've never been in there. Listen, I need to get back to sleep. If you have an emergency, call the sheriff's non-emergency line. The number's on the sheet. He hung up. I stood in the corridor, looking at the door. The fluorescent tube on the other side had reached full brightness. The corridor behind the glass was now clearly visible. 8 doors that I could count. 4 on each side, all closed. The floor tiles were a green flecked pattern I hadn't seen anywhere else in the building. The bulletin board had 3 sheets pinned to it and what looked like a photograph, but I was too far away and at too sharp an angle to see the photograph clearly. I wrote it up in my field notes. Locked door in east corridor, south side, approximately 15 feet west of pool, entrance. Door opens into corridor not shown on 1974 site plans. Corridor extends approximately 60 feet with 8 visible doors. 1 fluorescent fixture active. Area identified by county maintenance as old annex, reportedly not in use. Not included in current survey scope, unable to access, no key provided. Recommend inclusion in Phase 2 assessment or separate survey prior to demolition. I photographed the door and the view through the wire glass window. The flash reflected off the glass in the first shot, so I cupped my hand around the lens and took a second one. In the second photograph, the corridor was visible. The light, the doors, the bulletin board. Then I went back to work. The thing about overnight sampling is that there's a lot of waiting. The pumps need to run for 4 hours minimum, and I'd started them at 7:15, which meant the earliest I could collect the cassettes was 11:15. I had my walkthrough documentation to finish, but I'd covered most of the building by 10:30. The meeting rooms in the West Wing were unremarkable. Folding tables stacked against walls, a projection screen still mounted to the ceiling in the largest room, more 9x9 floor tiles. The Senior Services Wing had a small kitchen, a crafts room, and an office with a nameplate still on the door that read Barbara Hess, Program Coordinator. I documented everything. I took my samples. I filled out my forms. By 11, I was done with every accessible space in the building. I sat in the front office, the one closest to the entrance, where I'd set up a folding chair and my laptop, and began entering my field data into the digital forms. The building was quiet in a way that felt like pressure. Not silence exactly, because there were sounds. The electrical hum from the panel, the occasional tick of the roof contracting as the temperature dropped outside, the distant rhythm of my 6 sampling pumps, pulling air through their cassettes at 2 liters per minute. But the sounds were so constant and so low that they functioned as a kind of anti-sound, a texture of quiet that made any interruption feel enormous. At 11:08, I heard a door close. Not slam. Close. The sound was distant, muffled, and it came from the east side of the building. A latch engaging. The specific mechanical click of a door being pulled shut until the bolt seated in the strike plate. I sat still. I waited. Nothing followed. I told myself it was thermal expansion. Doors in old buildings shift. Frames warp. A door that's been resting against its frame without being fully latched can pull itself closed as the metal contracts in the cold. It happens. I'd heard it before. But I'd also been through every room in the building except the ones behind that locked door, and every door I'd come through, I'd left open. My sampling stations required airflow between rooms to get representative readings. I'd propped the gymnasium doors open with a rubber wedge. I'd hooked the meeting room doors on their hold-open catches. Every door in the building was either locked or open. Every door except the ones in the annex. I didn't go check. Instead, I collected my cassettes. I went to each station, stopped the pump, removed the cassette, capped it, labeled it with the station number and the stop time, and placed it in a labeled bag in my sample cooler. The process took about 20 minutes. At Station 4, which was in the gymnasium, the pump had stopped on its own at some point. The display showed a fault code, E04, which on the Gill Air means a flow restriction. Something had partially blocked the inlet. I checked the cassette and found a fine layer of grayish residue on the filter that was thicker than what I'd expect from ambient dust, even in a building that had been closed for 4 years. It looked almost like calcium deposit, chalky and uniform, as though the air in the gymnasium had carried something denser than normal particulate. I bagged the cassette separately and made a note to flag it for the lab. At 11:40, I was back in the front office packing my equipment. I had everything I needed. The report would be straightforward: recommend asbestos abatement for the vinyl floor tiles and the pipe insulation in the office wing and the gymnasium air handler. Flag the pool mechanical room for a targeted lead paint assessment. Note the annex as an unsurveyed area requiring separate evaluation. I could be out by midnight if I moved efficiently. I was zipping my sample cooler when I heard the second sound. This one was not a door, it was a voice. Muffled, indistinct, and coming from deep within the building. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. The cadence of a sentence, the rise and fall of someone speaking at a normal conversational volume, but too far away and too dampened by walls and corridors to resolve into words. I stopped breathing and listened. The building settled around me with its usual small noises. The pumps were off now, so the mechanical sounds had dropped to almost nothing, just the panel hum, just the roof ticking. And then nothing. I'd been working alone in closed buildings for over a year. I'd heard sounds before. Old buildings are full of them. Pipes contracting, animals in walls, wind finding gaps in the envelope. Once, in a factory in Parkersburg, I'd heard what sounded exactly like a man coughing, and it turned out to be a pigeon trapped in an air duct. Sounds in empty buildings are unreliable. Your brain imposes patterns on acoustic noise, especially when you're tired, especially when you've been alone for hours, especially when something earlier in the night has already put you on edge. I finished packing. I carried my first load of equipment out to the truck. The parking lot was absolutely dark except for my headlamp and the light from the building's front doors. The temperature had dropped in to the low 30s, and there was a thin fog sitting over the drainage ditch. I locked the equipment in the truck bed and went back inside for the second load. Walking back down the main corridor, I made a decision I've turned over many times since. I turned right at the junction and walked toward the pool. I don't know exactly what I intended to do. I think I wanted to look through the wire glass window one more time and confirm that the corridor was still there, that the light was still on, that I hadn't manufactured the whole thing out of fatigue and suggestion. If it was still there, I'd photograph it again, note it in my report, and leave. If it wasn't, if the corridor was dark, or if I'd somehow misread a storage closet as a hallway, then I'd know my mind had been playing tricks and I could discount the sounds too. The corridor was still there. The fluorescent tube was still on. But something had changed. One of the 8 doors was open. It was the third door on the left side, about 35 feet down the corridor. It stood open at maybe a 45-degree angle, and through the doorway, I could see what looked like the edge of a desk and the corner of a filing cabinet. An office. The room beyond the door was dark, but the fluorescent light from the corridor spilled in far enough to catch those 2 details. I took a photograph through the wire glass. The camera flash fired, and in the instant of white light, I saw something else in the corridor. Something on the floor near the far end, near the double doors. A shape. Low, irregular, dark. It could have been a pile of clothes or a trash bag or a collapsed box. The flash was too brief and the angle too oblique for me to make out anything specific. By the time the afterimage cleared, the corridor was back to its steady fluorescent normality, and the shape at the far end was too deep in shadow to see. I took 3 more photographs in quick succession. Flash, flash, flash. In each one, the corridor looked the same. The open door, the closed doors, the bulletin board, the floor tiles. The shape at the far end didn't appear clearly in any of the images when I reviewed them on the camera's LCD screen. The resolution was too low for that distance in those lighting conditions. I pressed my ear against the door. The metal was cold. Through it, I could hear the fluorescent tube buzzing. And under that, something else. A sound so faint that I couldn't be certain it was real, and not just the blood moving through my own ear. A low, intermittent vibration. Not mechanical, not electrical. It had an organic irregularity to it, like a rhythm that was almost but not quite steady. If I had to compare it to something, I'd say it sounded like breathing amplified through ductwork. But that's the kind of comparison you make afterward when you're trying to translate something shapeless into language. At the time, it was just a sound I couldn't identify. I stepped back from the door. I took one more photograph of the exterior of the door itself, the full frame, the lock hardware, the wire glass window. Then I went back to the front of the building, collected my remaining equipment, and loaded the truck. Before I left, I did one more thing. I walked around the outside of the building again, this time slowly, counting my steps, using the headlamp to examine the east wall in detail. I was looking for evidence of a sealed entrance, a bricked-over doorway, a discontinuity in the brickwork that would indicate where an addition had been joined to the original structure. I found nothing. The brick was uniform. The mortar was consistent. The foundation line was unbroken. Whatever was on the other side of that door, from the outside, it didn't exist. I drove back to Wheeling. It was a little after midnight, and Route 22 was empty, except for a couple of tractor trailers and a sedan that paced me for about 10 miles before turning off at a gas station near Weirton. The radio worked, but I didn't turn it on. I drove in silence with the heater running and the sample cooler on the passenger seat and my camera bag on the floor behind me. The next morning, I uploaded my photographs to the office server and began drafting the report. The building photographs were normal. Every shot of the offices, the gymnasium, the pool, the mechanical rooms looked exactly as I expected. Dust, water stains, aging materials, institutional decay. The photographs of the annex corridor were different. In the first photo, the one I'd taken through the wire glass window before the door opened, the corridor was visible but slightly out of focus, which was normal given the glass and the lighting conditions. The light was on, the doors were closed, the bulletin board was there. In the second photo, the one I'd taken after the door had opened, the corridor was sharper. I'd adjusted my angle to reduce the glass reflection. The open door was clearly visible. The desk and filing cabinet beyond it were clear. The bulletin board was clear enough that I could zoom in on my laptop and partially read the top sheet. It was a schedule, as I'd guessed, and the header read, Weekly Activity Schedule, East Annex. The dates were from 2003. But the bottom of the corridor, the far end where I'd seen the shape on the floor, was wrong. Not wrong in a way I could describe as a specific object or figure. Wrong in a way that was more like a rendering error, as if the photograph had failed to fully resolve that area. The space near the double doors at the far end was dark, darker than it should have been given the fluorescent light. The floor tiles, which were clearly visible for the first 40 feet of the corridor, seemed to lose their pattern in the last 10 feet, as though the resolution of the image degraded selectively in that area. The walls looked correct, the ceiling looked correct, but the floor and the space about 3 feet above it had a quality I can only describe as dense, like looking at a section of a photograph that had been printed with too much ink. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm aware that JPEG compression, low light artifacts, and lens distortion can produce all kinds of visual anomalies in photographs. I've taken thousands of photographs in dim, dusty buildings, and I've seen compression artifacts before. This was different in a way I could sense but not prove. The third and fourth photographs showed the same thing. The fifth, the last one I'd taken of the corridor, showed something I didn't notice until I'd been staring at the image for about 10 minutes. In the open doorway, the third door on the left, the desk and filing cabinet were still visible. But on the desk, there was an object that hadn't been visible in the earlier photos. It was small, light-colored, and rectangular. It looked like a piece of paper, a note, something placed on the desk between the time I'd taken the second photograph and the fifth. The interval between those two shots was maybe 90 seconds. I told my supervisor, Greg, about the annex when I turned in my field notes. I framed it clinically. Locked door, unlisted wing, not in blueprints. Recommend separate assessment before demolition. Greg nodded. I'll flag it for the county. The power's on in there, at least one fixture. Okay. Phil, the maintenance guy called it the old annex, said it hasn't been used in a long time, but couldn't tell me more. I'll put it in the letter to the county. They'll either add it to the scope or they won't. You got everything you needed from the rest of the building? Yes. Good. I went home. I slept. I wrote the report over the weekend. Materials assessment, sampling locations, lab chain of custody forms, photo log, recommendations. I included the annex note in the limitations and exclusions section exactly as protocol required. I submitted the report on Monday. The lab results came back the following Thursday. 5 of my 6 air samples were normal. Background levels of particulate. No asbestos fibers detected. VOCs within expected range for a sealed building of that age. The 6th sample, the one from the gymnasium where the pump had faulted, was flagged. The lab noted an unusually high concentration of calcium sulfate particulate, essentially gypsum dust, at a level that was inconsistent with the building materials documented in that area. The ceiling tiles in the gymnasium were mineral fiber, not gypsum. The walls were CMU block. There was no gypsum board in the gymnasium. The lab asked if there was an adjacent renovation or demolition activity that could account for the reading. I told Greg. He shrugged. Probably cross-contamination from the ceiling tiles in the offices. You had the doors propped open. The office ceiling tiles were mineral fiber too. I checked them all. Well, the pump faulted anyway. We'll note the anomaly and run it again if the county wants a resample. The county did not want a resample. They also did not respond to the recommendation about the East Annex. The report was accepted as submitted. The demolition was scheduled for January. I tried not to think about it. For about 2 weeks, I succeeded. Then, on a Wednesday night in December, I was at my apartment in Wheeling, organizing photographs from a different job site, and I found myself going back to the Civic Center folder. I opened the annex photographs again. I zoomed into the 5th image, the one with the object on the desk. I increased the brightness and contrast until the image started to break apart into noise, and right at the edge of legibility, I could make out what the object was. It was a sampling cassette, white, circular, with a cap on it. The exact kind I'd been using that night. An SKC 25mm cassette, the type used for asbestos fiber counting. I sat with that for a long time. I had collected all 6 of my cassettes. I'd counted them, bagged them, logged them, and submitted them to the lab. All 6 were accounted for. The cassette on the desk in the annex was not one of mine. But it was the same type, the exact same type. I went to the office the next day and pulled the county's project file. I was looking for any record of a previous environmental survey at the Civic Center. If another firm had done an assessment before us, before the building closed, during the closure at any point, there might be a cassette left behind, which would explain what I'd seen. There was no record of a previous survey. The file contained the county's request for proposal, Haldane's bid, the contract, the blueprints, and Phil's site access instructions. Nothing else. No prior assessments. No earlier reports. I looked up the building's permit history in the county's online records. The Civic Center had been built in 1973 and had one permitted renovation on record, a roof replacement in 1994. There was no permit for an addition. There was no permit for an annex. According to the county's own records, the building had never been expanded. The space beyond that locked door officially, had never been built. I called Phil. He didn't answer. I left a message. He never returned it. I called the county facilities office and asked about the east annex of the Civic Center. The woman who answered, her name was Donna, put me on hold for 4 minutes and then came back and said she wasn't sure what I was referring to. I described the door, the corridor, the location. She said she'd check with her supervisor and call me back. She called back the next day. I spoke with Jim. He says the Civic Center is a single-story structure with the gymnasium, pool, offices, meeting rooms, and senior wing. There's no annex. I was physically inside the building and I saw the corridor through a locked door. I photographed it. I don't know what to tell you. There's no annex in our records. If there's a locked maintenance area or utility corridor, that would be part of the original structure, not a separate wing. This wasn't a utility corridor. It was a full hallway with offices. I'll make a note of it. The building's coming down in January regardless. That was the end of the official conversation. The demolition proceeded on schedule. I was not involved. I should have let it go. The building was demolished. Whatever was behind that door was now rubble, and the rubble would be hauled to a landfill, and the lot would be graded and seeded, and within a year there'd be nothing there but grass and a drainage culvert. The annex, whatever it was, no longer existed. But in February, after the demolition was complete, I looked up the landfill manifest for the project. This is public record in Ohio. Demolition waste from any project requiring environmental clearance has to be tracked from site to disposal. The manifest listed the total volume of debris removed from the Civic Center site. 200 cubic yards. I ran the numbers against the building's footprint and height, using standard demolition volume estimates. A building the size of the Civic Center, the documented size, the blueprint size, should have generated approximately 2,800 to 3,100 cubic yards of debris. The demolition produced roughly 1,000 cubic yards more material than the building should have contained. I mentioned this to Greg. He said demolition volume estimates are notoriously imprecise. He said subgrade material, foundation work, and soil mixing can inflate the numbers. He said it wasn't unusual and it wasn't our concern. He was probably right. And there's one more thing and then I'm done. About 6 weeks after the demolition in early March, I received an envelope at the Haldane office. No return address, postmarked from Steubenville. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of what appeared to be a handwritten log entry. The handwriting was small and careful, and the entry read, March 14th, 2003, East Annex, Room 6. Air sampling complete. 4-hour run, 6 stations. Results within normal parameters. No fibers detected. Note: door between main corridor and annex should remain locked during sampling periods. Do not enter annex while pumps are running. Do not photograph annex interior. Equipment may be retrieved after sunrise. Samples submitted under Site ID 007734. M. Pruitt. Below the log entry, in different handwriting, looser, more hurried, someone had added a single line. She came back too. I searched for Monsieur Pruitt in every professional database I had access to. I found a Margaret Pruitt, who had been licensed as an environmental technician in Ohio from 1998 to 2006. Her license had lapsed. There was no current address, no current employer, no forwarding information. The licensing board's records showed that her last known employer was a firm called RTK Environmental Services based in Steubenville. RTK had closed in 2009. I drove to Steubenville on a Saturday. The RTK office had been in a small commercial building on 4th Street that was now a tax preparation service. The owner didn't know anything about the previous tenant. I went to the county library and searched the local newspaper archives for Margaret Pruitt. I found one mention, a brief item from 2004, in the community section of the Herald Star, listing participants in a county health department training seminar. Margaret Pruitt, RTK Environmental, was among 18 names. That's all I found. A name, a log entry, a license that expired 20 years ago, and a handwritten note that someone in 2003 had been sent to do exactly what I'd been sent to do. Sample the air in a building that contained a space the county said didn't exist. She had documented it. She had followed a protocol that acknowledged the annex. She had been told not to photograph it, not to enter it while sampling. She had known things I hadn't been told. And someone sometime later had written that she came back. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means she returned to the site or if it means something else. Something about the annex, something about what happens when you spend time near it. Something about why the corridor had a light on at 10 o'clock at night in a building that had been closed for 4 years. I don't know why someone mailed me the photocopy. I don't know how they knew I'd been there or that I'd seen the door or that I'd noted it in my report. The building is gone now. The lot is empty. I drove past it last month. Just grass and gravel and a concrete pad where the dumpsters had been. No indication that anything had stood there. No indication that anything had ever extended beyond the footprint of the blueprints. But the photographs are still on my laptop. I look at them sometimes. The corridor, the doors, the open office with the desk and the filing cabinet and the small white cassette that nobody placed there and nobody retrieved. The dark area at the far end of the corridor that doesn't resolve correctly, no matter how much I adjust the brightness. Last week I processed a new job, a pre-demolition survey at a closed elementary school outside Bel Air. Standard work, single-story building. The blueprints matched the structure. There was no locked door, no hidden wing, no discrepancy. It was exactly what it appeared to be. But halfway through the walkthrough, standing in a dark classroom with my headlamp on and the sampling pump clicking quietly on its tripod, I found myself checking the walls, running my hand along the CMU block, feeling for seams, listening for the hum of a fluorescent tube on the other side. The gypsum dust from the gymnasium sample was never explained. The 1,000 extra cubic yards of demolition debris were never accounted for. The envelope from Steubenville had no fingerprints except mine and the mail carrier's. I checked because Greg's wife works at the state crime lab and owed me a favor. Site ID 007734 does not exist in any Ohio environmental database. I've looked. The number follows the correct format for the era, but the record is simply absent, as though it was filed and then removed, or as though it was assigned to something that was subsequently decided to have never existed. I still have the photocopy of Margaret Pruitt's log entry. It's in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, under a stack of old field manuals. Sometimes I open the drawer and look at the handwriting, the careful printing of someone who took documentation seriously, who believed that writing something down made it real, made it part of the record, made it something that couldn't be denied. And below it, the other handwriting, hasty, almost scrawled. 6 words that I have no framework for and no way to investigate further because the building is rubble and the rubble is in a landfill and Margaret Pruitt is a lapsed license number and a single line in a 22-year-old newspaper. She came back too. I filed my report. I submitted my samples. I documented what I saw. That's what the job requires. You go to the building. You assess the materials. You note what you find. You write it down so that someone later can make informed decisions about what to do with the information. Nobody made any decisions about the annex. Nobody asked me a follow-up question. Nobody from the county, the demolition contractor, or any other agency ever contacted me about The space behind the locked door in the east corridor of the Jefferson County Civic Center. The building is gone. The record says it was a T-shaped single-story structure built in 1973 and demolished in 2026. Gymnasium, pool, offices, meeting rooms, senior wing, 2,800 to 3,100 estimated cubic yards of demolition volume. 4,200 actual. I think about that gap sometimes, the math of it. 1,000 cubic yards of material that came out of a space that was never built. I think about the light that was on in a corridor that didn't exist, and the door that closed by itself in a wing that the county says was never there, and the sampling cassette on a desk in a room that no one has entered in 20 years. And I think about Margaret Pruitt, whoever she was, sitting in that same corridor in 2003 with her own pumps and her own cassettes and her own headlamp, documenting something that someone later decided should not be documented, following a protocol that someone later erased, writing it down because that's what the job requires. She came back too, as though someone before her had also come back, as though coming back was what happened, as though the building or the part of the building that wasn't a building had a quality that Margaret Pruitt recognized and noted and couldn't escape, even after the samples were collected and the report was filed and the door was locked behind her. I haven't gone back. The building doesn't exist anymore. There's nothing to go back to. But sometimes at night, when I'm running samples in a quiet building, I check the walls. I listen for the buzz of a fluorescent tube in a room that shouldn't be there. I run my hand along the block and I wait for the seam, the place where the blueprints end and something else begins. I haven't found one again. I'm not sure if that's a relief or not, because the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that sits at the bottom of my thinking like sediment that won't settle, is that I didn't find the annex by looking for it. I found it by walking past it. It was just there, a door I almost didn't notice in a corridor I'd already walked through, leading to a space that shouldn't have existed and that, according to every official record, never did. And if it happened once in one building, then the question isn't whether it will happen again. The question is how many doors I've already walked past without stopping to look through the glass.